Abilene greeted Monday morning with the heat and dust typical of a Texas summer. With a population of 120,000, the city was large enough to get lost in the crowd, but small enough that reputation meant everything. Between the oil rigs and modern shopping malls, between the university campuses and industrial suburbs, there was a world of its own, a world where money mattered more than morals. Frank Collins opened the door of his auto repair shop, Collins Auto, at exactly 7 in the morning, as he had done for the past 15 years. His shop was located in an industrial area surrounded by workshops, warehouses, and small manufacturing plants. A tall man with graying temples and mechanic's hands, he was known as one of the best diesel engine repairmen in town. His customers included truck owners, oil company workers, and farmers from the surrounding area. "Morning, Mr. Collins!" Jose Rodriguez shouted as he opened the neighboring welding shop. Frank waved his hand, checking his phone for text messages. 3 messages from regular customers and 1 from Margot, his manager at his second business. Billy Johnson was the first customer with his Peterbilt. While Frank inspected the engine of the 18-wheeler, they discussed fuel prices and new road restrictions. No one would have guessed that this taciturn mechanic owned one of the most exclusive establishments in Abilene. At noon, Frank closed the shop for lunch and drove home to South Park, a respectable middle-class neighborhood with neat houses and well-kept lawns. His 2-story house was more than a mechanic could afford, but his neighbors knew Frank as a successful businessman who invested in real estate. "How's school?" he asked his wife, Susan, who was cooking dinner in the kitchen. "It's unbearably hot. The air conditioner in the classroom is broken again. The principal promised to fix it, but you know how it is," she replied, without turning away from the stove. Susan taught math to high school seniors at Jefferson High School. In 20 years of marriage, she had become part of the furniture in their home, always in her place, always predictable. But in recent months, Frank had noticed changes. She was staying late after work, looking in the mirror more often, and buying new clothes. "Any plans for tonight?" he asked. "Teachers' council until 9, then a meeting with the parent committee. I'll be home late." After dinner, Frank went down to the basement. Behind the old workbench, in a safe disguised as a toolbox, were the documents of his real source of income. The business that allowed them to live in a nice neighborhood, vacation in Florida, and save for retirement. The Wind Rose was located in a converted mansion in a historic part of town, close to galleries and expensive restaurants. Formerly, it was a private gentleman's club, and even the license was drawn up accordingly. Membership cost $5,000 a year, and additional services were discussed on a personal basis. The clientele consisted of oil tycoons, politicians, ranch owners, and influential lawyers. People who could afford discretion at a premium price. Frank never considered it prostitution, more like an elite escort service with added benefits. At 9 o'clock in the evening, he parked his Ford F-150 at the service entrance of the mansion. Margot Clark was waiting for him in the office on the first floor, a 35-year-old blonde, a former hotel manager who knew how to organize any event at the highest level. 5 today, she reported, showing him a tablet with notes. Senator Warren, 2 oilmen from Midland, Judge Houston, and a new client who owns a chain of car dealerships. By the way, Vicky wanted to talk to you. Frank nodded, feeling a familiar thrill at the mention of that name. Victoria Stone was special among the 8 girls who worked at the Wind Rose, not only because clients were willing to pay extra for time with her, but also because there was a connection between them that Frank couldn't explain even to himself. He found Vicky in the library on the 2nd floor, a room decorated in a classic style with leather armchairs and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. The 28-year-old woman with shoulder-length brown hair and green eyes was sitting by the window, leafing through a copy of Psychology Today. "Frank, thanks for taking the time," she said, putting down the magazine. "What's wrong? Problems with clients?" "No, it's not work. I'm thinking about leaving here, sooner than we planned." Frank sat down in the chair opposite her, trying to hide his unease. Vicky had been working for him for 3 years, saving money for a master's degree in psychology at the University of Texas. According to their agreement, she was supposed to work for another 1.5 years. "Has something changed in your plans?" "Yes, you could say that. I've met someone special. someone who is making me rethink my priorities. Frank felt a pang of jealousy, which he tried to suppress. A serious relationship? Very serious. So much so that I'm ready to change my whole life. Does he know about your job? Yes, he does, and it's not a problem. On the contrary, this man accepts me for who I am. After talking to Vicky, Frank couldn't concentrate on his usual tasks. He checked his accounts and met with clients, but his thoughts kept returning to her words. Who was this mysterious man who had changed the plans of his most ambitious girlfriend? At midnight, after making sure that all the clients were satisfied and the building was ready to close, Frank went out to his pickup truck. The Texas night was muggy, the air smelling of oil and asphalt. On the way home, he thought about his double life. During the day, he was Frank Collins, a mechanic, a husband, a respectable resident of Abilene. At night, he was the owner of the most exclusive establishment in town, a man who knew the secrets of half the local elite. Two lives that had existed in parallel for 7 years. Driving past Jefferson High School, he noticed several cars in the parking lot. The PTA meeting was indeed running late, or had Susan found another reason to stay out late? His wife was not home yet. Frank took a shower and went to bed, but sleep would not come. Questions swirled in his head. Who had changed Vicky's plans? Why did her possible departure bother him so much? And what was happening to his own marriage? At 3 a.m, Susan slipped quietly into the bedroom, thinking he was asleep. Frank lay with his eyes closed, listening to her take a shower and get ready for bed. For the first time in years, he felt like he was losing control of the situation, and that scared him more than anything else. Tuesday started off with trouble. At 6:30 a.m, Frank got a call from Jake Thompson, the owner of a construction company, complaining that his excavator had broken down in the middle of a construction site. Frank quickly drank his coffee and drove to the call, mentally calculating the losses from the downtime. As he fiddled with the hydraulics under the scorching Texas sun, his thoughts kept returning to his conversation with Vicky. In 3 years on the job, she had become more than just his best employee. Frank had feelings for her that he hadn't felt for his own wife in a long time. Her intelligence, ambition, and ability to hold a conversation on any topic set her apart from the other girls. "All done," he announced to Jake, wiping his hands on a rag. "But I recommend replacing the water filter next week, or you'll be back again." On his way back to the workshop, Frank decided to stop by Jefferson's school. Officially, it was to invite Susan to lunch, but in reality, it was to figure out her strange behavior over the past few months. The school hallway smelled of disinfectant and chalk. Frank found his wife's office on the second floor. Susan was explaining something to a group of high school students at the blackboard. A 42-year-old woman with blonde hair pulled back into a neat bun. She looked younger than her age. Frank noticed her new blouse, light blue, which accentuated her eyes. "Mrs. Collins has a visitor," he announced, peeking into the office. The students giggled. Susan blushed slightly, but smiled. "Class, open your textbooks to page 127. Do problems 1 through 5. Mr. Collins, what's the matter?" "Nothing much. I thought maybe we could have lunch together. It's been a while." "I'm on duty in the cafeteria today, maybe another time?" Frank nodded, but something in her tone seemed insincere to him. As he left, he noticed a bouquet of wildflowers in a simple glass vase on the teacher's desk. Susan had never been fond of flowers. "Nice flowers," he remarked. "Oh yes, the students gave them to me. They're so thoughtful this year." That evening, as Frank was closing up his workshop, he received a message from Susan. "I'll be late again, preparing for a test. Don't wait up for dinner." The Windrose was bustling. Tuesday was considered one of the best days of the week. Fewer family commitments for clients, more time to relax. Margot greeted him with her usual report and some news. "Senator Warren is requesting the entire 3rd floor for himself on Friday. Corporate event for investors. He's willing to pay a bonus." "How many people?" 12, plus entertainment for the entire evening. Frank nodded. Such events were the most profitable. Politicians and businessmen like to combine business negotiations with informal socializing. "Where's Vicky?" "In the East Wing, with Judge Houston." Frank went up to the second floor and walked down the hallway lined with Persian rugs. The Windrose was tastefully decorated. No tackiness, just expensive furniture, paintings by local artists, and subdued lighting. He found an empty room and sat down to wait for Vicky to finish. An hour later, she appeared in the doorway, slightly disheveled, but with her usual smile. Tough client? Not tough, just talkative. He told me about his family problems for an hour and a half. They went into the small living room. Vicky poured herself some water from the cooler and sat down in her favorite chair by the window. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," she began. "I'd like to discuss the details. When are you planning to leave?" "In a month, maybe a little longer. It depends on the circumstances." Frank studied her face, trying to find clues. "Is this man from Abilene?" "Yes, he's local, but I'd rather not discuss personal details." "Does he understand that you're going to quit school? Or at least put it on hold?" Vicky smiled. "Who said I'm quitting? On the contrary, now I have extra motivation to get my degree." "I don't understand." "This man inspires me to be the best version of myself. With him, I feel like I can achieve anything." Frank felt a familiar pang of jealousy. Over the past 3 years, he had grown accustomed to thinking of himself as Vicky's mentor, the one who helped her achieve her goals. And now someone else had come along who played that role better. "Are you in love?" Vicky paused, looking out the window at the city lights. "Yes, I think so. For the first time in my life, really." After the conversation, Frank returned to his office and took a bottle of bourbon from the bottom drawer of his desk. He didn't usually drink while working, but today he made an exception. Losing Vicky meant not only losing his best employee, but also parting with the only person who truly understood him. At midnight, he closed the restaurant and drove home. On the way, he decided to drive by the school. Maybe Susan really was there after all. The parking lot was empty, the windows dark, so his wife had lied. Susan was already asleep when Frank got home. He quietly went into the bedroom and lay down next to her without turning on the light. In the darkness, he thought about how quickly his familiar world was falling apart. His wife was acting strangely, his best employee was leaving, and he felt betrayed on 2 fronts. The next morning, Susan got up earlier than usual and spent a long time getting ready in front of the mirror. She was wearing new lipstick and perfume that Frank didn't recognize. At breakfast, she was unusually lively. "We have a teachers' conference at the university today," she said. "I'll be back late." "What time?" "I'm not sure. Maybe 10, maybe later." After she left, Frank made a decision. That evening, he would follow his wife to see where she was really going. 20 years of marriage gave him the right to know the truth. The day in the workshop passed in routine tasks, but his thoughts kept returning to his domestic problems. At lunchtime, he even thought about hiring a private detective, but dismissed the idea. He would manage on his own for now. In the evening, Frank told Margot he would be late and parked across from the house at 6:30. At 7:15, Susan left the house in a new dress, blue, form-fitting, emphasizing her figure. She got into her Honda and drove not toward the university, but toward the city center. Frank followed at a distance, trying not to lose his wife's car in the evening traffic. Susan parked at a small cafe called Mocha in the historic district, the same one where the Windrose was located. Frank stopped a block away and walked over. Through the cafe window, he saw his wife sitting at a table in the corner. Across from her sat a young woman with brown hair. Even from behind, Frank recognized her figure. Susan was meeting with Vicky. The world around him seemed to stop. His wife and his best employee were sitting at the same table, talking and laughing. There was clearly intimacy and trust between them. Frank stood on the sidewalk, unable to believe his eyes. He watched for 10 minutes, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then Susan leaned across the table and took Vicky's hand. The gesture was too intimate for a simple friendship. Frank turned and walked to his car, feeling himself burning with rage and confusion. His wife was seeing his employee. The woman who had shared his bed for 20 years was secretly seeing a woman he had feelings for. All the way home, he tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe they met by chance. Maybe they have common interests. But the gestures, the looks, the intimacy of their communication spoke otherwise. At home, Frank poured himself a large whiskey and sat in the living room waiting for his wife to return. Questions swirled in his head. How long has this been going on? What connects them? And the most frightening question of all, could Vicky really be the special person who made her want to change her life? Frank didn't sleep all night. Sitting in the living room with a glass of whiskey, he waited for Susan to return and tried to make sense of what he had seen. His wife came back at 10:30, quietly went into the bedroom, thinking he was asleep. Frank lay with his eyes closed, listening to her take a shower, feeling everything inside him boil with rage and pain. At breakfast the next morning, Susan was unusually lively. She hummed as she made coffee and even kissed her husband on the cheek, something she hadn't done in months. "How was the conference?" Frank asked, studying her face. "Wonderful. So many new ideas for working with children. I met some interesting people." Lying came easily to her. 20 years of marriage, and he didn't know his wife was such a skilled deceiver. Who exactly? Mostly colleagues from other schools. We exchanged experiences. Frank nodded, pretending to believe her. But inside, a plan was forming. He needed to find out more about his wife's relationship with Vicky, to understand how deep it went, whatever it was. In his workshop, he couldn't concentrate on his work. His hands performed the familiar actions, but his thoughts raced between anger, jealousy, and painful curiosity. How did they meet? What connects them? And most importantly, does Vicky know who Susan really is? During his lunch break, Frank didn't go home, but drove into the city center. He parked near Jefferson High School and waited. At 1 o'clock, the teachers began to leave the building for lunch. Susan was one of the last to leave. She got into her Honda and drove not toward home or a cafe, but to the South Park Mall. Frank followed at a distance, parking so he could see the entrance. 10 minutes later, a familiar figure appeared. Vicky was walking from the opposite entrance. Even from a distance, it was clear that she wasn't dressed for work. Jeans, a plain white t-shirt, sneakers. Her hair was loose, she wore minimal makeup. She looked younger and more natural. The women met at the fountain in the center of the mall. Susan kissed Vicky on the cheek. The gesture was natural, familiar. They went shopping, holding hands like friends. But Frank saw more. Their closeness, their trust, the way they looked at each other. He followed them at a distance, hiding behind shop windows. In a clothing store, Susan helped Vicky try on dresses, and they laughed and talked about something. In a bookstore, Vicky showed his wife some psychology textbooks. It was a normal scene between close friends, except for one fact. One of them was his wife, and the other worked in his brothel. The most painful moment came in a jewelry store. Susan was showing Vicky something, and the girl was trying on a bracelet. The saleswoman smiled at them as if they were a couple choosing a gift. Frank stood behind a column, clenching his fists and feeling rage rising inside him. After an hour and a half of shopping together, the women headed for the exit. At Susan's car, they hugged each other, long and hard, not like friends. Frank saw Vicky whisper something in his wife's ear, how she laughed and kissed her on the cheek again. Back at the workshop, Frank couldn't work. He sent his assistant home early and locked himself in his office, trying to collect his thoughts. The picture was becoming clearer, but that didn't make it any easier. His wife and her, what could he call Vicky? A colleague or more? That evening at the Wind Rose, Frank saw Vicky in a new light. She was working with customers professionally, as always. But now he knew she had another life, a life that somehow intersected with his own family. At 10 o'clock, when the flow of customers had subsided, he asked Vicky to come to his office. "How's it going with your special someone?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Good, very good," she smiled, sincerely, brightly. "You know, Frank, I never thought I could be this happy. Tell me a little about it. Where did you meet?" Vicky paused for a moment. "At the library. I was preparing for college, studying psychology. She helped me find the book I needed." "She?" "Yes, it's a woman, I thought you guessed." Frank nodded, though inside he felt a knot in his stomach. His suspicions were confirmed. "And how did the relationship develop?" "Slowly, cautiously. She's a married woman, you understand? She's in a difficult situation. But we're right for each other. She's smart, kind, understanding. She makes me feel like I'm real. Every word cut like a knife. Vicky was describing his wife, the woman he had lived with for 20 years, but, as it turned out, didn't know at all. What about her husband? Does he know? No, not yet. That's the hardest part. She's afraid of destroying her family, but she can't live a lie anymore. We're trying to find the right way to work things out. Frank felt the blood rush to his face. So they were planning to work out his marriage, discussing how best to destroy his life. And what have you decided? Nothing concrete yet, but I'm willing to wait as long as it takes. Relationships like this only happen once in a lifetime. After the conversation, Frank locked his office and took out a bottle of bourbon. Alcohol didn't help. His thoughts only became cloudier and the pain sharper. He had built the perfect system: work, family, a secret business. Everything was under control, and now that system was falling apart because the two women in his life had found each other. At home, Susan was reading in bed. When she saw her husband, she put down her book and smiled. "You're late tonight." "Work? What have you been doing?" "Checking tests, preparing for tomorrow's lessons." The usual routine. Frank sat down on the edge of the bed. "Sue, is everything okay between us?" "What do you mean?" "Our marriage. I feel like we've grown apart." Susan paused, staring at the ceiling. "Maybe we have. 20 years is a long time. People change." "Have you changed?" "Yes, I think so. I've started to understand what I really want out of life." "And what do you want?" Susan turned to him. "Honesty. With myself and with those around me. I'm tired of pretending." "Pretending what?" "That I'm satisfied with what we have. That I'm happy with this life." Frank sensed the conversation was heading in a dangerous direction. "What are you unhappy about?" "We live like neighbors, Frank. We eat at the same table, sleep in the same bed, but we're strangers. When was the last time you asked me about my thoughts, my dreams, my fears? When was the last time we talked about anything other than everyday stuff?" The question caught him off guard. Indeed, when? Their conversations were limited to plans for the day, bills, and news. They functioned like a well-oiled machine, but they didn't live like a loving couple. "I thought you were happy with our life." "I tried to be happy, but I recently realized that life is too short for pretense." "What changed?" Susan was silent for a long time. "I met someone who made me remember what it means to feel, to be alive." Frank clenched his fists under the blanket. "Who?" "It's hard to explain. It's too early to talk about it." "Are you having an affair?" "No, not an affair, something else, something important." The next day, Frank decided to take action. He couldn't just wait for two women to decide the fate of his marriage and his business. He had to take control of the situation. In the morning, he installed a tracking app on Susan's phone while she was in the shower. Then he drove to the workshop and asked his assistant Carlos to keep an eye on the place while he followed his wife. Susan did indeed spend the morning at school, but during her lunch break, she went back to the mall. This time, she met Vicky at a cafe on the second floor. Frank sat down at a table at the opposite end of the room, hiding behind a newspaper. The conversation was serious. Susan was explaining something, gesturing with her hands. Vicky listened attentively, nodding occasionally. At one point, Susan began to cry, and Vicky hugged her across the table. The scene was so intimate that Frank felt like a voyeur. Then something happened that completely destroyed his world. Susan leaned toward Vicky and kissed her on the lips. Not a friendly kiss on the cheek, but a real, passionate kiss. Vicky responded, and for a few seconds they forgot about the world. Frank stood up and left the cafe, feeling nauseous. His wife had kissed his employee. The woman who had shared his bed for 20 years loved another woman. And that other woman was the only person at Windrose whom he had ever truly loved. He sat in his car for 10 minutes trying to calm down. His thoughts raced between rage, pain, and a desire for revenge. How dare they? How dare they cheat on him, make plans behind his back, ruin his life? That evening at the brothel, Frank looked at Vicky with new eyes. Every smile she gave her client seemed fake, every laugh a mockery. She was playing a role, just as she had played a role with him all these years. At midnight, when the establishment closed, he was left alone with Vicky in the small living room. "I have something to tell you," he began. "What's wrong? You look upset. I know who your special someone is." Vicky turned pale. "What?" "Susan Collins, my wife." There was a long silence. Vicky stared at him with wide eyes, unable to say a word. "Did you know?" Frank asked. "Know what?" "That she's my wife." Vicky nodded slowly. "Yes, from the very beginning." "And you decided to play with me? To have fun at my expense?" "No, it's not like that." Vicky stood up and walked over to the window. "When we met, I didn't plan anything like this. It just happened." "What exactly happened?" "Love. Real love. For the first time in my life." "What about me?" Vicky turned to him. "What about you?" "I thought there was something special between us. Frank, you're my employer. A good, fair employer, but still an employer." "Only? What else?" Frank realized that she had never seen him as a man. To her, he was a source of income, nothing more. And he had built illusions, invented feelings that weren't there. "Are you planning to destroy my marriage?" "We're not planning to destroy anything. Susan is in pain. She doesn't know what to do. She doesn't want to hurt you." "It's a little late to think about that. Frank, please try to understand. Nobody wanted this to happen, but sometimes the heart decides for us." Frank looked at her. A beautiful, intelligent, passionate woman who loved his wife more than he had in recent years. And for the first time in many years, he felt that he was completely losing control of the situation. Friday arrived with the feeling of a storm brewing. Abilene was suffocating in the July heat. The asphalt was melting under the sun, and the air conditioners were working at full capacity. Frank spent a sleepless night thinking about his conversation with Vicky. Her words burned worse than any insult. "You're my employer, a good, fair employer, but still my employer." For 3 years, he had believed that there was a special connection between them. For 3 years, he had seen something more than professional respect in her eyes. It turned out, he was wrong. Worse, she loved his wife, a woman he had fallen out of love with years ago but continued to consider his property. At breakfast, Susan was unusually nervous. She broke 2 cups and asked the same question several times. When Frank asked about her plans for the weekend, she hesitated to answer. "I need to go to Dallas, to my sister. She's having problems with her husband." Another lie. Susan didn't have a sister in Dallas. Her only sister lived in Portland and hadn't spoken to her in 5 years after a family quarrel. "For long?" "The weekend. I'll be back Sunday evening." Frank nodded, pretending to believe her. Inside, a wave of anger rose. So they were planning to spend the weekend together. A romantic getaway at his expense while he worked his ass off. He couldn't concentrate on his work in the workshop. Carlos asked him several questions, but Frank answered distractedly, replaying the scenes from the last few days in his mind. How they had laughed at him. How they had discussed him behind his back. During his lunch break, he drove to the school and parked so he could see the exit. Susan showed up right on time, got in her car, and drove not toward home or the mall, but toward the outskirts of town. Frank followed cautiously, keeping his distance. His wife stopped at a small motel called Desert Rose, a place where locals took their mistresses. Frank parked across the street and waited. 10 minutes later, a taxi pulled up to the motel and Vicky got out. She was dressed simply in jeans, a white shirt, sneakers, and her hair was braided. She looked younger and happier than ever. The women embraced at the entrance to the motel. Even from a distance, you could see their excitement and joy at seeing each other. They disappeared into room 15, and Frank was left alone with his thoughts. He sat in his hot car for an hour, imagining what was happening in that room. His wife and his employee were making plans for the future. They discussed how best to tell him about the divorce. They laughed at their naive husband, who suspected nothing. By the end of the day, the plan was finalized. Tonight, Senator Warren's corporate event would take place at the Wind Rose. Vicky would be working late, and after closing, they would have their final conversation. At home, Susan was packing her suitcase, humming to herself. Frank watched from the bedroom door as she packed new underwear and perfume she had never bought for him. "What time are you leaving?" "My flight is at 8. I'll be at the airport by 7. Want a ride?" "Thanks, but I already called a taxi. I don't want to bother you." She kissed him on the cheek, perfunctorily, like a distant relative. There was no guilt in her eyes, only impatience. She wanted to leave as soon as possible to start a new life. "See you on Sunday," she said, picking up her suitcase. "See you," Frank replied, knowing he was lying. The Wind Rose was bustling with activity. Senator Warren had rented the entire third floor for an event with investors. 12 influential men, the best girls in the establishment, expensive alcohol, and exquisite appetizers. Evenings like this brought in the most profit, but today Frank wasn't thinking about money. Margot bustled about, coordinating the waiters and making sure the service was top-notch. The girls were wearing their best dresses, and their makeup was flawless. Vicky looked especially stunning in a black cocktail dress that accentuated her figure. "Great job," Frank said to her as she passed his office. "Thank you. It's a nice crowd tonight, very pleasant people." She smiled, professionally, distantly. Now he understood the difference between that smile and the one she had given Susan in the cafe. The event lasted until midnight. The guests gradually dispersed, satisfied with the evening and promising to return. Senator Warren personally thanked Frank for organizing the event and paid a bonus for the excellent service. By 2 o'clock, only Frank, Margot, and 3 girls, including Vicky, remained in the building. Margot was counting the takings, while the girls cleaned up after the event. "You can go," Frank said. "I'll close up." "Are you sure?" Margot asked. "There's still a lot to do." "I'll manage. Tomorrow is Saturday, you should rest." Margot and the girls left, tidying up as best they could. Only Frank and Vicky remained in the building. She went upstairs to tidy up the east wing. Frank poured himself a bourbon and sat down in an armchair by the window. Abilene was asleep, and only a few cars passed through the deserted streets. Somewhere in the city, his wife was spending the night with another woman, a woman who worked for him, whom he trusted, whom he loved. "Frank, can we talk?" He turned around. Vicky was standing in the doorway, having changed into jeans and a t-shirt. Her makeup was washed off, her hair was down. He hadn't seen her like this in 3 years. "About what?" "About what happened yesterday. I couldn't sleep all night thinking about our relationship." "What relationship?" Frank put his glass on the table. "You said I was just your boss." "I said something stupid. You're important to me, Frank. Not as a man, but as a friend, a mentor, someone who believed in me. But not important enough to tell me the truth about my wife." Vicky sat down in the chair opposite him. "I didn't know what to do. When we met, I didn't plan on falling in love. It just happened." "And then you decided to play with me?" "We never played. Susan is suffering. She doesn't know how to tell you the truth. She doesn't want to ruin your life." "My life is already ruined. Frank, please try to understand. You don't choose love. It comes when you don't expect it." Frank stood up and walked over to the bar. He poured himself another bourbon and drank it in one gulp. "How long has this been going on?" 4 months. "And all this time you've been cheating on me." "We didn't want to hurt you. Susan was going to talk to you after the weekend." "What weekend? The one you spent at the motel?" Vicky blushed. "You were following us?" "How else could I find out the truth? You lie so easily." "We weren't lying. We were just putting off a difficult conversation." Frank turned to her. There was such rage in his eyes that Vicky involuntarily recoiled. "Difficult conversation? You call destroying my marriage a difficult conversation?" "Frank, your marriage was over long before we met. Susan has been unhappy for years. You live like strangers. That's none of your business." "But it's her business. She has a right to happiness." "And I don't?" Vicky stood up and walked over to him. "You do, but not at her expense. Let her go, Frank. Give us a chance." "Us?" Frank grabbed her by the shoulders. "Us? You work for me. You live off my money. Your education, your apartment, your future career, it's all thanks to me." "I know, and I'm grateful. But that doesn't mean you own my life." "I do." His fingers dug into her shoulders harder. "I pulled you off the street. I gave you a job, a roof over your head, a future. And this is how you repay me? By seducing my wife. I didn't seduce her. She came to me. She came to you what? Frank shook her by the shoulders. She threw herself into the arms of a whore? Vicky broke free from his grip. Don't you dare say that. Not about me, not about her. What else can I say? What else can I call what you're doing? Love, real love, the kind you and she never had. The slap sounded like a gunshot. Vicky fell into a chair, clutching her burning cheek. Frank stood over her, breathing heavily. Get out! What? Get out of my establishment, out of my city, out of our lives. Vicky stood up, her eyes flashing with rage. You can't make me leave! I can, and I will. I'll tell everyone about your business, about what you really do. Frank smiled. Who? The police? Half my clients are police and judges. The tax office? My books are in perfect order. My wife? She already knows. She knows? Of course she does. Where do you think the money for our house, her car, our vacations comes from? Susan always knew what she was living on. She just turned a blind eye while it suited her. Vicky paled. Clearly, Susan hadn't told her about this. You're lying. Ask her yourself, if you can. What do you mean? Frank walked over to the safe, took out the Glock 19 he kept for protection, and checked to see if it was loaded. Frank, what are you doing? What I should have done a long time ago. I'm putting my life in order. Vicky backed away toward the door. You're crazy. On the contrary, for the first time in months, I'm thinking clearly. Put the gun down, let's talk calmly. What is there to talk about? You destroyed my family. You betrayed my trust. You used my kindness against me. I didn't use anyone. I fell in love with my wife. Frank pointed the gun at her. Vicky pressed herself against the wall, her eyes wide with terror. Please, Frank, don't do this. Think about the consequences. I've thought about it. I've thought about it for 3 days. And I've realized that without you, everything will go back to the way it was. Susan will realize she made a mistake. We'll fix our marriage. It won't work. She won't come back to you. She will. She won't have a choice. His finger twitched on the trigger. Vicky covered her face with her hands. Frank, I beg you. I have dreams, plans. I want to be a psychologist, to help people. I want to live, and I wanted to save our family. But you ruined everything. I didn't ruin anything. I just fell in love with the wrong person. The shot rang out deafeningly in the silence of the night. Vicky collapsed to the floor, a red stain spreading across her white t-shirt. She was still breathing, her eyes staring at Frank with incomprehension and pain. Why? She whispered. Frank lowered the gun. His hands were shaking. His ears were ringing. Because you stole my life. Vicky tried to say something, but blood came out of her mouth. She reached out her hand as if asking for help, but Frank stepped back. A minute later, her breathing stopped. Victoria Stone was dead. Frank stood over the body, unable to believe what had happened. A few seconds ago, she was a living, beautiful, intelligent woman. Now she was just a dead body in a pool of blood. What had he done? The phone in his pocket vibrated. A text message from Susan. Landed safely. My sister picked me up at the airport. Love. Frank stared at the message, then at Vicky's body. His wife still didn't know that her lover was dead. She didn't know that their plans for a future together had died with her. He sat down in a chair and poured himself some bourbon. His hands were still shaking, but his thoughts began to clear. He had to get rid of the body, cover his tracks, come up with an alibi. Outside, dawn was breaking over Abilene. The city was waking up, unaware that a murder had just taken place in a respectable neighborhood. Frank Collins, a respected mechanic and family man, had become a murderer. Saturday, 6:30 a.m. Frank had been sitting in his chair for 4 hours, staring at Vicky's body. The shock was gradually receding, giving way to cold calculation. He had built a successful business because he knew how to solve problems methodically and without panic. Now he was faced with just another problem to solve. First, he searched Vicky's pockets and her purse. A phone, apartment keys, a wallet with $300, lipstick, condoms, the standard set. The phone showed 17 missed calls from Sunshine. That's what Vicky had saved Susan as in her contacts. The last call was at 2:47 a.m., half an hour after the murder. Frank deleted all the text messages between the women from the last month, deleted the photos, and cleared the call history. Then, he smashed the phone with a hammer from the toolbox and threw the pieces into a dumpster behind the building. The body was another problem. Vicky weighed about 50 kilograms, but her dead weight seemed much heavier. Frank wrapped her in a tarp from the basement, carried her out through the back door, and loaded her into the bed of his pickup truck. By 7 in the morning, he was already driving down Highway 83 toward the desert. 40 miles from the city, he turned onto a dirt road leading to an abandoned oil field. Oil had been extracted here in the 1950s, but the wells had long since dried up. Now it was a wasteland with rusty derricks and crumbling concrete pads. Frank chose a spot between two leaning derricks and began to dig. The sandy soil gave way easily, but the Texas sun was already beating down mercilessly. 2 hours later, the hole was ready, shallow but sufficient. He dropped the body into the hole, covered it with sand, and tamped it down with a shovel. On the way back, he stopped at a car wash and thoroughly cleaned the dust off his pickup truck. At home, he took a shower, burned his clothes in the basement furnace, and changed into clean clothes. By noon, he was in his workshop, spending his Saturday as usual. Carlos was surprised to see his boss. "Mr. Collins, I thought you were taking the day off." "I couldn't sleep. I decided to work." He fiddled with the truck's engine, but his mind was far away. What would Susan say when Vicky didn't answer her calls? How long could he keep up the pretense of a normal life? On Sunday morning, the first text message from his wife arrived. "Vicky isn't answering her phone. Have you seen her?" "No, what's going on?" "We were supposed to meet today. She was supposed to fly to Dallas, but her flight is delayed." Frank smiled. Susan still thought he believed the story about his sister. Meanwhile, he was thinking up a new lie about the flight delay. Maybe there's a problem with her phone? Maybe, but that's not like her. On Monday, Susan returned from Dallas looking worried and nervous. During dinner, she checked her phone several times, trying to call Vicky. "Maybe she's sick?" Frank suggested. "She would have let me know. We were supposed to meet tonight." "What for?" Susan hesitated. "Just to talk. We've become friends." On Tuesday, Susan went to Vicky's apartment. She returned even more worried. "The neighbors say they haven't seen her since Friday. Her car's in the driveway and her mailbox is overflowing. Maybe she left with someone? Where? With whom? She would have told me." Frank shrugged. "People disappear sometimes. Maybe she met someone, fell in love." Susan looked suspicious. "How do you know she could have fallen in love?" "I don't know. Just a guess." On Wednesday, Susan filed a missing person report with the Abilene police. The case was assigned to Detective Jim Riley, a 38-year-old veteran of the department with a reputation as a meticulous investigator. Riley started with Vicky's apartment. It was a small place in a student neighborhood, with psychology books and everything neat and tidy. There were no signs of a struggle or a hasty departure. The clothes in the closet, the cosmetics in the bathroom, and the money in the nightstand were untouched. A neighbor named Dorothy Clark said that Vicky was a quiet girl who worked in an office downtown and was preparing to go to college. On Friday evening, she saw Vicky leave in a taxi around 9 o'clock, but she hadn't seen her since. The office downtown piqued Riley's interest. He checked Vicky's tax returns and discovered that she was officially employed by Texas Rose Consulting Group, a company that turned out to be a front. Her real employer was hidden behind layers of shell companies. After 2 days of painstaking work, Riley found the Windrose. It was a private gentlemen's club with a license to serve alcohol and host private events. The owner was Frank Collins, a respected businessman and mechanic. On Thursday, Riley arrived at the auto repair shop. Frank was working under the hood of an old Chevrolet when the detective introduced himself and showed his badge. "Mr. Collins, I'm investigating the disappearance of Victoria Stone. She is listed as an employee of your company." Frank climbed out from under the hood and wiped his hands on a rag. "Yes, Vicky works for me. What happened to her?" "She's missing." "When did you last see her?" "On Friday evening. We had a company event and she worked late." What time did she finish work? Around 2 in the morning. Then I sent everyone home. How did she get home? I don't know. Probably by taxi. Girls usually call a taxi. Riley wrote down every word. How would you describe Vicky? What kind of employee was she? Good. Responsible, punctual. The clients loved her. The clients? Yes, she was a hostess. She entertained the guests and kept them company. I see. Did she have any personal problems? Frank pretended to think for a moment. I don't know. We didn't discuss personal matters. It was strictly professional. Any romantic relationships? Not my business. Although she mentioned she was seeing someone. She seemed happy lately. After the detective left, Frank called Margot. The police are investigating Vicky's disappearance. They may come to you with questions. My God, what happened? I don't know. She hasn't been home since Friday. She probably ran off with someone. That's not like her. People change. Tell the girls to be careful what they say. We're just a private club, after all. On Friday, Riley returned, but this time to the Wind Rose. Margot met him in the lobby, nervously fingering some documents. Detective Riley, Abilene Police Department. I'm working on the Victoria Stone missing person case. Yes, Mr. Collins warned me. What a terrible story. Vicky was such a nice girl. Tell me about Friday's event. How was Vicky acting? Normal. She was working with clients, polite and professional. What time did the evening end? Around 2. The guests left and we cleaned up for another half hour. Who stayed to clean up? Me, Vicky, Lisa, and Carmen. Did you all leave together? Margot hesitated. No, Mr. Collins said he would close up himself. He let us go home. And Vicky? She stayed. She said she wanted to talk to Mr. Collins about something work-related. Riley looked up from his notebook. What exactly? I don't know. She didn't say. The detective questioned the other girls. Lisa Rodriguez confirmed Margot's words, but added a detail. Vicky was upset that evening. She checked her phone several times and seemed distracted. Did she say anything was bothering her? No, but I saw her staring out the window for a long time, as if she was waiting for someone or watching someone. Carmen Vasquez, the youngest of the girls, was more candid than the others. Detective, can I tell you something in private? They stepped away from the others. Vicky was planning to leave us. She was going to go to college. Did Mr. Collins know about this? I think so. He wasn't taking it very well. Vicky was his favorite. What do you mean, his favorite? Well, he treated her differently. He talked to her longer, trusted her more. Some people thought there was something going on between them. What did Vicky think? She said he was just a good boss, but lately she had been avoiding being alone with him. This information made Riley look at the case in a new light. He returned to studying the financial documents of Wind Rose and discovered an interesting detail. The establishment's income was significantly higher than that of a typical club. Too much for simple entertainment services. On Saturday, he interviewed several customers of the establishment. Most were reluctant to talk, but a businessman named Robert Houston let slip. Detective, I don't want any trouble. I have a family, a reputation. We were just relaxing there. Nothing special. What do you mean, relaxing? Well, the girls were friendly, very friendly, if you know what I mean. The picture was becoming clearer. The Wind Rose was not just a club, but a disguised brothel, and Vicky's disappearance could be connected to this business. On Sunday, Riley received the results of the phone records analysis. Over the past 2 months, Vicky had most often called a number registered to Susan Collins, the wife of the club's owner. The detective arrived at the Collins house on Sunday evening. Susan opened the door, pale and with red eyes from crying. Mrs. Collins? Detective Riley, Police Department. Can I ask you a few questions about Victoria Stone? Susan glanced into the house. Of course, come in. They sat down in the living room. Frank was reading the newspaper in an armchair, pretending not to listen. Mrs. Collins, how did you know Miss Stone? We became friends. We met at the library a few months ago. Did you see her often? Yes, quite often. She's a lovely girl, very intelligent. When did you last speak to her? Susan glanced at her husband. On Friday morning. We were planning to meet up over the weekend, but she didn't show up. Didn't show up where? I was in Dallas at my sister's. We agreed to meet there. Was Vicky supposed to fly to Dallas? Yes, but her flight was delayed and then she disappeared. Riley made a note. Mrs. Collins, what was your relationship with Miss Stone? Susan blushed. What do you mean? Just friends? Or something more? There was a long pause. Frank put down the newspaper and looked at his wife intently. We were close friends, Susan finally said. I see. Did you know where Miss Stone worked? In some office downtown, something related to counseling. Did she say she worked at your husband's establishment? Susan turned sharply to Frank. What? Vicky worked as a hostess at my club, Frank said. I thought you knew. No, I didn't know. Susan's voice trembled. She said she had an office job. Riley watched the couple's reaction. Susan was clearly shocked, while Frank seemed too calm for someone whose employee had disappeared. Mr. Collins, did you tell your wife that her friend worked for you? I didn't think it was important. Besides, we don't discuss work at home. After the detective left, a scandal erupted between the couple. You knew where she worked and you didn't say anything. You knew she worked and you didn't say anything either. What do you mean? Sue, stop lying. I know about your relationship. Susan turned pale. What relationship? You were seeing her. I saw you in a cafe, in a shopping mall, in a motel. You were following me? What else could I do? You've been lying for months. Susan sat down on the sofa and covered her face with her hands. My God, where is she? What happened to her? I don't know. But I think she just ran away. Where? Why? Maybe she got scared, realized she was going too far. Susan raised her head. Frank, you know something. Tell me the truth. I don't know anything. She worked for me. She disappeared, that's all. But Susan saw the lie in his eyes. For the first time in 20 years of marriage, she was truly afraid of her husband. On Monday, Riley received the results of the financial analysis. Over the past few years, millions of dollars had passed through the Windrose accounts, far more than a regular club could earn. The detective also found a recording from a surveillance camera at a nearby bank. On Saturday morning, at 6:43 a.m., Frank Collins's pickup truck drove past the camera in the direction of the desert. Riley organized a search of the old oil field. On Tuesday, search dogs found a fresh sand mound between two abandoned oil rigs. An hour later, bomb disposal experts recovered Victoria Stone's body. Frank Collins was arrested on Wednesday morning at his auto repair shop. Detective Riley read the first-degree murder charge in the presence of several witnesses. Frank Collins, you are under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Victoria Stone. You have the right to remain silent. Frank did not resist. When the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, he simply said, I want a lawyer. The trial lasted 3 months. The prosecution presented compelling evidence. The defense attorney tried to prove that the murder was committed in the heat of the moment, but the jury did not believe it. Too many circumstances pointed to premeditation, hiding the body, destroying evidence, attempting to create a false alibi. Susan testified against her husband. She talked about her relationship with Vicky, how Frank had been stalking her, his jealousy and threats. Her testimony was decisive for the prosecution. Frank Collins was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In his final statement, he said, I don't regret what I did. She destroyed my family. The Windrose was closed by court order. The building was sold, and the new owners turned it into a regular restaurant. Margot and the girls moved to other cities. Susan filed for divorce a week after the verdict. She sold the house, took a leave of absence from school, and moved to another state to live with her parents. The grief over Vicky and the guilt over what had happened haunted her for months. Detective Riley received praise from his superiors for solving the difficult case. In an interview with a local newspaper, he said, This case showed that even respectable families can hide terrible secrets. Frank Collins built his life on lies and control. When he lost control, he chose violence. Victoria Stone was buried in the Abilene Cemetery. Her college classmates, several teachers, and Susan attended the funeral. A simple inscription on the granite stone read, Victoria Stone, 1997 to 2025. Dreamed of helping people. In prison, Frank spent his days in solitary confinement. He felt no remorse. He still believed he had done the right thing in protecting his family from destruction. He blamed his wife's betrayal, not his own actions, for the family's eventual collapse.